You are listening to Blissquick Pop on Shades Radio. This is our 35th edition, and today we have an exclusive interview with Michael McCaughan. He is a friend and an author, and as they say on the internets, Michael McCaughan is an Irish author and journalist best known for his work in Latin America. He has written extensively for the Irish Times, The Guardian, Hot Press, and Village magazine. He is the author of 3 works of non-fiction: True Crimes, 2002, The Battle of Venezuela, 2005, and The Price of Our Souls, 2008, and also Coming Home, One Man's Return to the Irish Language, published in 2017. He lives in the Burren, County Clare, and he is my very own bestest friend, West Coast Che Guevara. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, because we're all on different time zones. Michael, we share a few fond memories that maybe we'll talk about a little later on, but we also share a love for punk music. And today I would really like for us to focus our conversation around how music has somehow shaped your way of life, train of thought, etc. And I'd like to go back to the beginning and when we met. We met in Trinity College, I think sometime in 1982.
That's right, Danielle. And I guess just as a kind of my own introduction, my own preface here is that anytime something like this arises, which isn't very often, in which there's going to be an interview that's not just about one aspect of my work or one aspect of one country in Latin America, I do think about sort of the architecture of memory. And it's interesting that you mentioned memories, because as I sort of the hour loomed, we'll say it loomed, Danielle, because there is this feeling of,
Yes.
oh, I'm going to go on the record and say things in a very improvised way, because that's the way I tend to operate. But I did think about how this interview, how this conversation would have gone if we'd had it 30 years ago, how the interview would have gone if we'd had it 20 years ago, how the interview would have gone if it was 10 years ago, if it was even a week ago, or yesterday, or the day after tomorrow. And I realized that as time passes, the way I reflect on the questions you're asking me are really evolving and changing continuously, and they're being added to. It's like these ripples that then come back at you, so that, going right back now to when I met you at that time, I'm now thinking about that in the context of everything that's happened since. So that's kind of just an interesting, for me, it reshapes the way I consider that era and myself in that era, because it's now myself in this era looking back on a time of what were great certainties. So I guess when I met you, I would have, I wasn't long out of school. I was absolutely in the grip of punk rock fever, and the fever of changing the world, and the fever of every minute counts. It still does, but in a different way. And that, getting to gigs, getting things, organizing music, organizing gigs, connecting people, hanging out with people, living on a bicycle, sleeping wherever. That was just the way of being back then, and it was in a sense, a time of great excitement. And I guess I met you. You looked to me like a senior figure
I
by the
know.
standards of
I
18-year-olds.
still am.
You still are. You still are. You're maybe a veteran rather than merely a senior figure. And I remember you telling me, you knew some of the people that were, for me, mad as it sounds, like say the Liverpool scene, the Pete Wiley scene, the Zoo scene. That was all. Everything outside of even my little area in Dublin was pretty exotic. And the manner in which information arrived was slow and limited. It was whatever you saw in the NME or didn't.
Mm.
And forget gigs. Bands, most interesting bands weren't playing Dublin. And so, Teardrop Explodes, lots of those bands that, well, I had seen them, as it happens, but it was the world was only just starting to expand in that sense.
Yes, and it's interesting in that regard that Michael Murphy, and you are a friend of Michael Murphy. We all are friends of Michael Murphy, and we had him on the show before, and we will have him again in August. But he posted something recently which I thought you would like to probably react to. He counted the gigs that he went to. He came to the figure of 5,000 recently. He
Oh my.
celebrated 5,000 gig. And I was thinking, how did he get to that amount of gigs?
Yeah.
Would you be in that league at all?
I wouldn't be in that league simply because there's a kind of a two, that's a kind of a 5 decade gig scale. Well, 4.5 decade. And for me, I would be under the half mark because I missed 2 decades essentially being in South America and living in places where getting to live gigs just wasn't the same. The opportunities weren't there. And so I'm certainly, a lot of gigs, but to quantify, I
Yes.
can quantify the records I have, I can quantify the albums, the singles, the this, the that, but
Yeah,
hard to get at the
you have
gigs.
a large collection of records. I saw it last year. You really have a large collection of records.
I do. I have in the region of sort of 4,000 albums and 1,000 singles, probably. Yeah, that's big.
Yeah, so maybe for people who don't know you, we'll kind of recap a little bit. When I met you, you were a first-year student in French. Were you studying Spanish as well then?
That's right.
Yeah, so a language student, and you were the one and only person who was wearing a Mohican haircut. Was it 1981?
82.
Or 82. But then the following year, you became Ents officer. Now, for our American friends, I don't know if they have that in American universities, but you were elected to the position of Ents officer, which means that you were organizing the social life for the college. And Michael Murphy told us in his prior interview that basically you in particular were a complete model for his way of grasping the music industry, basically. Because as you mentioned earlier, there were very few bands, never mind punk bands, that were playing in Dublin at that time. So maybe you'd like to talk to us about what happened when you became Ents officer and what you got to do as an Ents officer, who you got to invite and so on.
Yeah, well, I guess the beginning point is why. Why run for election and why
Yes.
become the entertainment officer? So in some ways, it was as if the gig scene in Dublin was a microcosm or a small sample of what was wrong on a bigger scale. So it was very corporate, very controlled. You had these MCD and a handful of agencies that basically had a monopoly on gigs and bands coming in. They placed bands in certain venues and they charged a certain amount, and it was built around that model. Whereas the punk scene was a bit more from the bottom up. It was that a group of fans might get together or a small group of people might get together, and they would not, profit would not be on their minds. Trying to break even might be, and just but try more important than that, trying to get a band that didn't have that commercial network and maybe that commercial outlook, giving them a chance to play. And so there was a purpose to becoming entertainment officer beyond, my ego and gratification, and the fact that you got to live in Trinity, which was very helpful, and you earned a small wage, and you had a year off college. They were all very helpful things when you were Ents officer. But it was this idea of changing, later it became changing the world, but in a sense it was changing the music scene, was a big was a kind of a real passion at that time, because that was my most immediate scene. My most immediate scene was not, say, a working class neighborhood in Buenos Aires or a movement in Mexico. It was simply it was a kind of a gig scene in which some people were shut out and some people were shut in, and which, as you said, the only Mohawk in Trinity, it was a lonely enough place to be at that time because people looked at you and had obviously their own prejudices around that. And so, you were aware
What
that you
a
were.
breath of fresh air, though. What a breath of fresh air for me, anyway, to have a student like you.
Well, this is it. I'm glad to hear that. And because also, I guess, being a following the Joe Strummer line, Joe Strummer sort of said, when asked what punk rock was, he said exemplary manners. And there was this way in which, as an ambassador of a new world, you actually, the idea of the punk falling around, harassing people and pushing people around the place is ridiculous. It was the person who got up, who got out and sorted something out and made some change and got themselves a venue or got themselves going on something that was meaningful. And
Yes.
in Ireland, the kind of that, let's call it the heteronormative theocracy, was all about going to the pub, maybe or maybe not going to the church, but certainly being respectful of the homogeneity of Irish society and the stagnancy. And so for me, that scene, whether it was the pub scene, the church scene, even the Irish trad scene back then, and all that was involved around, broadly speaking, a kind of a nationalist perspective, didn't speak to me at all. And then punk did, and you had a band like DOA from Canada who were very important to me, even though all I could find was I think it was an 8-track EP, 12-inch, and I mean those tracks were like 1 minute 58 each. You weren't getting too much out of it, but their big banner was "No God, No Country, No Lies," and then I found out that one of them had been in prison for activism, and I thought, right, this is an interesting bunch of people who they sing, they play, and they do well, and they're on it. They're actually acting out their ideas.
Yeah. And so maybe you could talk to us about the bands that you give us names, for example. You talked about Joe Strummer. But in terms of bands that you invited to play that year, and maybe Irish bands or other bands or even French bands.
Uh-huh. Oh, yes. Danielle smiles knowingly. Well, I guess at that time, I was very aware also of the stereotype, because people on the campaign trail, and the campaign, the actual act of doing the campaign was an absolutely transforming experience, which I didn't expect, because the campaign was something you had to do to get this job that was interesting and desirable. So you put together the nuts and bolts of a campaign. But as I look back on it, an awful lot of things I've done since, the skills I had to grapple with are all about that. I ended up, and I can tell you, I ended up getting 1,189 votes.
Right. You remember the number.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah. And I spoke to every one of those voters, I would guess. And I went to every sort of lecture, every possible lecture of every possible course that I could. And I had, they let you in at the beginning of a lecture for like 3 minutes to speak. And, did the interviews with the media, the Trinity media, and just was on the trail, drew up a manifesto, which I still have a copy of. And you look at it now and you think, yeah, I'll still stand over that. That's all right, surprisingly, when you were, 20 years of age. But the act of campaigning like that, and people coming at you with the stereotypes, but you're only into punk music, so you're only going to have punk music on. You suddenly had to become this person who was capable of firstly of persuading and explaining that no, just because you had that mohawk didn't mean you only listened to, the Dead Kennedys. So I ended up committing to a really diverse range of music that would be mostly almost entirely free of charge. And at the same time, I suppose outside college, there was this notion that only people inside college should be attending these events, that this was a privilege for Trinity students, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I had a network of people outside college through the gigs, and I was really looking forward to them participating in this Trinity experience, which was the exclusive preserve of, back then, a far more elite group than now, for sure. So anyway, with that going on anyway, got elected, to my surprise, to some extent, because I was running against somebody who was an incumbent, in the sense that the Ents job was passed on from person to person within a small group, a clique of people who were connected to MCD and the other promoters. So they got themselves nice bands, but they did it by virtue of ceding control, if you like, to a bigger agent who gave them the gigs or not. So anyway, Dublin, of course, was thriving with bands, absolutely thriving. And so as soon as I set up shop above the JCR, this is the gateway into Trinity, very visible. Suddenly you're there and people are knocking on your door and they're bringing in demos. So it goes from that absolute grassroots, anybody can walk in off the street and have a conversation with you, to going to London and knocking on doors and seeing about how you might break into this monopoly situation and get bans, and how hard your efforts are to make that happen. So in the course of that year, I mean, I guess that for me, probably one of the highlights was organizing the first Pogues tour of Ireland. So they had toured with Elvis Costello, but not on their own. So I contacted, and it's interesting where this all goes. So their manager was Frank Murray, and he had been a Tin Lizzy manager before that. And I chatted to him, and we had a lot in common politically. We had a couple of great chats, and he was happy to do that, and so on. And he ended up being part of the Alex Cox Nicaraguan filmmaking expedition. So it all linked into this thing that was growing for me anyway, which is around Central and South America and the Sandinistas and the revolutionary ideas. So Ents is always bringing things in. And I mean, you wouldn't call it a gig, but we also hosted the Nicaraguan vice presidents and an entourage of people, including Michael D. Higgins, who, for a big, what was, by the standards of a revolutionary government, a strong welcome, a strong semi-official welcome through Trinity College and the National Concert Hall, to, giving them a chance to, they were touring, it was punk bands were touring, and bigger bands and pop bands, the Bluebells, who had a top 10 hit at the time, were played, and various bands like that, Irish bands, Stockton's Wing, bigger Irish bands, but also then other people coming through. And that, of course, became, how can we look around us and see, are there any other bands in Europe that you might get? Because, that can be tricky. So thanks to you, I presume, we found the Coronados and Bélier Noir, and an incredible combination, those two bands, a very odd combination, at the same time very complementary in their own way, even though they're in very different territories. And so what about a French cultural evening? And of course we build it, you don't bill it as a shock horror, a shock horror zombie night. It was the French cultural evening with an encounter with French culture, because it is an encounter with French culture, just because it's not Françoise Hardy or Renaud. It can still be a good old French cultural encounter.
Yes.
But of course, these things always, thankfully, these things also get out of hand now and again. And that evening got out of hand.
Yes.
But, that becomes part of the legend. And yes, they played, they were excellent. And, almost everyone had a good time.
Yes. Broke all the equipment.
Yeah, equipment may have been broken. A window may have been smashed.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that was, in a sense, the only occasion during the year in which that happened, which is back to our heteronormative pub scene, broken windows and people, being pushed around and punched and falling over and ending up in A&E is a far, far, far more frequent occurrence than ever occurred at punk gigs, with, of course, the major exception of the Ramones gig, and so on.
Yeah. So, so, what kind of records are you thinking of maybe playing to illustrate this segment? What kind of, what's in your head in terms of showing us the music you were listening to at that time?
Yeah, well, there's kind of two phases of my relationship with music. And the first bit is very private, and it's me from the age of 8 years. So had a record player from the age of, I was 6. And I bought my first record at the age of 8 and a half. And an older brother, 8 years older, was bringing records into the house.
Yeah.
So the records are starting to appear, but it's this thing. I listen to them mostly alone in a room, and I'm reading what's on the cover. I'm really intensely studying a record. But the real leap comes when I go to see the Specials, my first sort of grown-up independent gig of my own, when I was 15. And that was life-changing. That was life-changing because it was out of control. And again, you know, living this middle class, very nice, posh school experience, everything's quite comfortable and predictable. To go into that place where there were skinheads, there were punks, there were people like jumping over each other, and then there was the Specials and Dr. Feelgood. The Specials were only the support band. You know, there was Dr. Feelgood as well, by the way. And
Yeah.
it was an absolutely extraordinary gig in which it was as if your body suddenly switched on to a whole new set of experiences that you wanted to repeat as quickly as possible, and which brought you into connection with other people up close and personal and physical, but not in that male way of fighting and you know, necessarily. It was more about moving around people and watching out for other people. It became that thing of eventually, you know, pogoing, stage diving, all that stuff, which people debate forever as to whether it's okay or not in the gig. But it became that thing of crazy movement, unpredictability, and chaos with these bands like the Specials that were playing music that was so pure, despite being a absolute melange of styles that go all the way, that come, it's Jamaica, it's London, it's all sorts of things going on. It's Coventry, it's working class, you know, England. It's multiracial. This is Ireland. This is white bread Ireland in the late 1970s and early 80s. And it is an absolute eye opener and a stunner. And I've never, you know, just like those votes I counted back for you, that gig is incredibly important
Yeah.
in terms of my development. So the Specials, and the other thing I was going to say to you about music, how I experience music, is that when you have one single in your record collection, you play one single and the B-side to death. Then you have two, then you have 12, and then you have 15. So at some point I was playing records hundreds of times and even thousands. So the first Specials album got played thousands of times. I've no doubt about that. And when you think about putting that much attention into a piece of art, it's extraordinary. Like, that music lives inside it has grown inside at an age which it's almost genetically embedded in my system. And so it goes for the Clash and the Dead Kennedys and other stuff I was listening to at the time. And so it has a permanent, perpetual meaning beyond the music of it itself. It's an
Yes.
amazing almost symbiosis or something. And so when I hear that music now, and when I listen to it, and I do, not so frequently, but I do. Funnily, I listened to the second album a lot, which was kind of a little bit less valued at the time. But their second album is an absolutely extraordinary document, brave second album by a band who had done so well and were having number one hit singles in the period of their first album. Anyway, that just gives you an idea of how I was, how the Specials would have been such a core part of the move into a new phase of listening and appreciating music.
Yeah. I mean, I know for sure that when I got to Ireland, I had lived in Liverpool, as you mentioned beforehand, and I had gone to many gigs there. But to be quite frank, when I saw the Golden Horde play live in Dublin, and I think we went to many gigs by the Golden Horde, whom we've played on a number of occasions, and I would hope to have Bernie speak one day on the show as well. I think the Golden Horde were possibly, in my experience, one of the best performing bands I have ever seen in my life. Complete show people, and I think Irish bands have that at the moment. I don't know if you've heard about them, Tau and the Drones of Praise. They're an incredible live band. They would be mixing the Rolling Stones and traditional and kind of hippie. They're just, the latest thing that, I've seen them 3 times this year. But anyway, I think Irish bands have something almost sacred about them, about the performance, what they do. And I think the Golden Horde, I don't know, what are your memories of the Golden Horde?
Absolutely central. And if it wasn't for the Virgin Prunes, I would absolutely agree that the Golden Horde were the
Yeah.
most important live act of the era. And I say that because it took one gig by the Golden Horde for me to abandon my dream of joining a band, because I actually saw on stage a band that could do anything I wanted to do better.
Yeah.
And I had flirted and been part of bands before that, but the Golden Horde made, if I could just, all I have to do is turn up and enjoy the Golden Horde. So Michael
Yeah.
Murphy was talking about 5,000 gigs. I didn't see the Golden Horde 5,000 times, but I saw every gig I could reach in the years when they were around. And they were, again, you went in, and from the moment the first member, usually Des, he might have been wrapped in a US flag, which we would then, of course, take off him and burn, ideally.
Yes.
He's an ace provocateur and a kind of a Zen philosopher as well, and an amazing guitar player. And again, the emphasis is these are amazing musicians who choose to play, who in a sense make life difficult for themselves by trying to play a very simple musical structure in an extraordinary way. And their songs were, their live performance was everything. Their records for me never lived up to the live experience. And it's very, I wish I've DJ'd, I was, DJing on radio, pirate radio back then. I very rarely played the Horde simply because it didn't do them justice when you
No.
heard them on record.
Yeah, I agree. I
So,
agree.
but anyway, the Horde then, and the lovely thing about that era is that the Horde then become, to some extent, one or two members become your friends. In other words, you went to see a band, but you also chatted. Chances are you ran into them. You had some overlap if you were that passionately involved. And our friends, we used to go and see them in places, for us, far-flung places like Mullingar,
Yes.
halfway around the world, Mullingar. And so they recognized you, and they were hanging out before the band. They weren't like, there was no distance. They weren't sort of hanging out in some, sauna, uh, sauna jacuzzi in somebody's castle next door. They were just, they probably
Yeah.
barely had a dressing room,
Yeah. Yeah. Drinking champagne and so on. But anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think you mentioned the special, and that'll give me. I know we went around with the Golden Horde a little bit, but that gives me a segue to the next section of your life, which I had a little flavor of because we lost contact on it for a number of years, because you went on your travels, and so the next period of your life, I got a little insight into it because recently in Dublin there was an international literature festival, and there was an event which was, I suppose it was meant to be an outdoor event, but ended up being an indoor event on Fitzwilliam Square, where you basically created, I mean, I thought it was such a punk thing as well, as such a punk performance, because so unexpected. You went about recollection and remembrance, that route, and you gave us a kind of a repertoire of stories which you linked up to music of your personal experiences of your life, your visits to Latin America. So I'd like to hear a little bit more of that. How, first of all, I guess, were you fluent in Spanish when you started traveling there? And why did you, well, I mean, you talked a bit about the Nicaragua movement, so presumably you traveled to Latin America originally for these kind of purposes,
Yes,
establishing links.
I was very lucky in that I began learning Spanish at the age of 12 in secondary school, and I had excellent teachers. And so by the time I did my leaving cert, I had a very thorough grounding in the grammar of Spanish. And I then went to college to pursue, as I met you, Spanish and French. And that did more drilling because we then moved on to Latin American literature, the type of things you don't do in school. That's coupled with this developing consciousness through punk, which sort of has its high point in the Clash's Sandinista album. And it's as if I've been given my passport and my bags, and I've been booted out the door to Nicaragua, where I turn up in 1985 at the age of 21. And I'm a kid. I realize now I was a child. I didn't think I was. I thought I was a very mature adult with a lot to say. But I realize now I'd sort of thrust into this world of a revolution in the making, year 6, under pressure. They've got these contra rebels on the border, they've got this economic blockade, they've got this sense of constant emergency. And then you've got these amazing structures being built around land distribution and childcare, releasing women to do other things, and just a new society, which coming from Ireland, which was absolutely stagnant still in 1985, very stagnant and very, very grey. This was just a blast of color, like a rainbow of possibility. And so I was thrust into this in essentially as an observer, because I'd saved up. And again, this is thanks to Ents. I earned that little bit of money and I got my ticket. It didn't cost, by the standards of the time, it wasn't expensive. I got my boat from Dunleary, at which not just my entire family, but my first Spanish teacher turned up, my parents, all my friends and relatives, because going to Nicaragua in 1985 was extraordinary.
Yes.
And so the journey was interesting, because it took some time. You took the ferry to England, you got your train, you got to London, you got to Panama. No direct flights, of course, to Managua, because it's a pariah by the standards of capitalism. And then you take a bus to Costa Rica and a bus to Managua, and you arrive basically yesterday, the 18th of July. Today's the anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I woke up on the 19th of July, this day. How many years ago, Danielle?
Well, mine 85, so something
38.
ending with an 8. Yes.
Yeah, 38 years ago. I wake up to these sort of megaphones and trucks circulating around the neighborhood saying the big rally is on, it's the big day. And you go out and you join these streams of people, all in their red and black finery. And then you go and the finest bands are playing for the revolution. So there's dancing, and they really like their human pyramids. So you've got like 20 people down below, 14 in the next row, 8 in the next, 6 in the next, 2. And there's this lone person with a flag standing about 50 feet in the sky. So all this is really mind-blowing without any need for chemical enhancement. And so that was my introduction to Nicaragua. And it all, they were under pressure, and I saw a lot of public opinion was to some extent turning, because there was a certain sense in which people, the average person not necessarily directly involved in a revolution, says to themselves, people are pragmatic, and they're hurting badly, and the hurting is going to continue until the US are satisfied that there's a government they like. So they were voted out of office for many, many reasons, but that moment was very, very important, and it set the tone for the rest of my life. It, in some ways, à la recherche du Nicaragua perdu. Yeah, there was that sense. You see, I haven't lost it all, Danielle. Your teaching stands the test of time also.
Oh, yes.
Anyway, in a sense, that became...
Brel lives on,
Yes.
Yes.
It becomes that sense of there's a yardstick to measure life and possibility against. And so everything's possible. Another world is possible, to use a cliche, which looked like it was sort of happening and being made real.
Yes. One of the really fun stories you had, I think, in the event we went to recently, is the story of the Chiquita banana girl. I would love for you to tell that story, if you don't mind.
Sure. So again, in my collection, I'm digging through the collection. It's great fun. This idea of a vinyl storytelling event, which combines playing records with picking a particular theme. Could be the Cuban Revolution, it could be the Irish language, it could be anything, plus visuals, makes for the stories start to suggest themselves. And Carmen Miranda is an absolute definite, because here's somebody who came of age when the US were kind of thinking, how can we make friends and be liked in Latin America? And so Carmen Miranda appeared at the perfect time in the guise of an ad for bananas. Bananas were just becoming a thing, as they say. Nobody was eating bananas until Carmen Miranda made this little video in which she explained the uses and care of a banana. And so Carmen Miranda becomes the highest paid woman in the United States in 1945, which is extraordinary. So Hollywood take to her. She's making films, but she is this every woman in Latin. She's supposed to represent all of Latin America. In other words, she's smiling, she's easygoing, she's not asking any tough questions, she's compliant, and always ready to say, "Yeah, we're your friends," and speaking in English and singing in English. And so she recorded that amazing song, "A Weekend in Havana," which, without knowing it, just sums up the US relationship with Cuba. You know, this idea of coming down for a weekend and basically the place is yours. So anyway, and then of course, as all these stories go, Carmen Miranda then makes the same film in Argentina and the same in Brazil. So she's kind of selling all these. She's like a Bord Falcha tourist official extraordinaire, a one-woman operation selling Latin America to the North Americans as this easygoing, friendly place. But you know, it's simply not the reality. And it's kind of interesting then how the story turns when you look at the other side of things. And so she's promoting these bananas for this company, Chiquita, who used to be Standard. They were called Standard Fruit, and they decided they were the sort of the owners of destinies in Central and South America. And I remember at the time reading Garcia Marquez, one of his books, 100 Years of Solitude, in which he described this massacre in 1928 of banana workers who were peacefully protesting slave-like conditions. And the company, you know, had a private security. They went ahead and ordered, between them and the army, they just massacred these people who were striking, anybody who was in their way. And that, you know, then that becomes, well, that was then, this is now, and everything's changed. And has it though? Because in court next year in Colombia, there are, you know, a couple of thousand family members who are taking Chiquita to court for massacres that have been committed in the past 25, 30 years. So you've got a company which has consistently used violence to subject the local population, you know, not as part of a counterinsurgency operation, but simply as a means to keep wages down and to make sure that workers are not involved in their unions and that union leaders are always under threat.
Yes.
And so the continuity of that Carmen Miranda symbol, whereby she's singing up this banana world, it's so interesting when you bring it right through to next January, when these cases are finally going to court 25 years later, and the victims, whose, you know, brothers, sisters, parents, loved ones, were shot dead by right-wing paramilitaries in Colombia or wherever, will have a chance to actually speak in court and at least talk about reparation and recognition of what happened. Yeah. So it's a kind of a powerful symbol of the way in which so little has changed in Latin America, even as so much has changed.
Yeah, and for you at the personal level, I think it also establishes a continuity between the punk rock interests, so to speak, with unveiling to some extent social injustices, and, you know, trying to build, as you said before, behave in an exemplary manner. So I think in your case, would you say that you began writing when you were visiting these the Latin American countries? Would you say that this was your way of getting, you know, writing for Ireland, for, you know, the British Irish press? Was that a way for you to renew your engagement, your political engagement, or did you have a choice in the matter? Did you, you know, is it something that you just decided to do, or, you know, kind of came onto you, or is it something that you decided was, you know, something of a political gesture?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's a question that has evolved over time because, at that age in Nicaragua, I ended up working. It's like, what can I do that might be useful? I don't simply want to stand around looking at people in Nicaragua, uh, you know, uh, visiting, looking, and going home. Like, where do I fit into this, and in what way could I be part of this movement, but always relating it back home because the Nicaraguans are making their own revolution, and they don't need a callow youth from Ireland to tell them how to do it. And so back then it became again my Spanish and English skills. I when I was in Nicaragua that time, I worked with the Guatemalan Church in Exile, and again, it's kind of ironical that having railed against the church in Ireland for so long, you end up working for the Guatemalan Church in Exile because that is an institution that matters and has currency for the Guatemalans and acts as a kind of a critical institute buffer and platform for human rights denunciations, abuses, and so on and so forth. And the church of the poor in Latin America, the theology, the liberation of theology is a completely different. It's hard to recognize it as part of the Catholic Church, and of course, it wasn't. It was silenced, and priests were sent into exile and told to shut up. Leonardo Boff is told by the Pope he can't speak for a year. So you had this powerful institution. I ended up translating eyewitness testimonies of massacres in Guatemala. And that's another kind of shocking thing because in nearby Guatemala, you had a policy under Reagan, of course, a policy under Reagan and the Guatemalan dictatorship that said you drained the countryside of all the support the guerrillas might have. Therefore, you massacred men, women, and children in villages, indigenous villages. And so you had villages that were literally erased. And so they would round up people, they would kill them. There'd always be one or two survivors because that's the way things work. Somebody would have got away and then got to Nicaragua or somewhere. But the bulldozers would then come in and actually break up everything else so that it was creating new zones of control. Your option was you either fled to another country or to the jungle, or you moved into this army. It was called balas y frijoles. So it was this idea of beans and bullets. We give you the beans and we have the bullets. So you come into our army organized refugee camps in your own country, because you're then under army control and you're then being under the surveillance and the control of the army. You're not in this area which has been contested by the guerrillas. So anyway, I learned an awful lot, obviously, through the experience, and that I felt, it felt useful to be doing that. But then when I came back, I kept a diary and I ended up writing a feature because I had a connection with the music press. I wrote a feature for Hot Press and was paid for it. And I kind of realized, well, this is interesting because I had people telling me, reading the article and telling me I didn't know that about Nicaragua. So you were actually helping to spread the word of what was happening. And that has become important in Ireland through the years because you have coffee brigades going over there. You've got solidarity campaigns around the banana issue. You've had a very strong campaign for justice for banana workers in Central America, et cetera, et cetera. So that became a mechanism. How can I be in Latin America? How can I be useful in Latin America? So the writing became that way of being useful. But over the years, that was tested because really, writing has its own limits. And at some point you realize that these men and women in the battlefield are very close to the battlefield, are, risking their life and everything else to do what they're doing. So there's a temptation to cross a line as a journalist, which I would have crossed because it seemed like the right thing to do. And it's what I wanted to do. So yeah, over the years, I would have sort of moved closer to that insurgency as I got to know things better and find my place and my balance. Also, you have to find your balance because you can get in over your head very quickly. You can be foolish very quickly. So it took. I feel like it was only when I was about 30 years of age and the Zapatistas came along that I found a place where I had my feet on the ground and could be more useful.
Yeah, and then so during those times, it's probably, music, listening to music probably seems kind of frivolous. when people are being massacred and are suffering very severely in the way that maybe we have no idea here or at this period in time. But so at that stage, were you listening to music from Latin America, or were you still listening to punk rock? You know, how, you know, what did you see there? Did you see that the Western music had made its entrance in the society? What, you know, what were your observation of of music at that time of your life?
I see there are three sort of strands to that question. The first is that it didn't seem frivolous to listen to music, and the survivors of the massacres, the community of Guatemalans in Nicaragua at that time, and the Salvadorans who sought refuge at that time, music was very important. And I remember buying, you know, I bought a lot of albums in South America, and one album I bought was the Misa Campesina and the Misa Popular. And so you had like a bishop like Pedro Casaldaliga, who celebrated, he had his own church, and it was a bright church full of murals. And the people were, you know, were actors in the mass. They weren't just observers in the mass. There was discussion. The mass would stop and the bishop would ask a question, you know, is maybe based on the sermon, and saying, what do you think of that? What do you think of what, you know, somebody did in that story? And they'd answer and say, well, you know, in our experience, this, that, and the other, and in our community, the people who were supposed to be the leaders weren't, or whatever it was. And they also had these their traditional instruments, which would have been very much considered museum pieces in their own countries. The elites love to see the marimba in at a big occasion where people are dressed up, quote unquote, in traditional dress, as they call it, for a special occasion, but it belongs to museums and formal occasions. Whereas this was the living culture and music of the people, and it was lively. And so I guess it was new to me, but I took that, you know, once you understood the context of this popular mass in which critical thinking was absolutely central, and in which the bishop was simply one more person in the community, because the bishops were often worker priests and worker bishops. I became, you know, I really began to connect with that music. And so I have a large collection of Latin American music that is, you know, we know the salsa music is fantastic, and that belongs to another context, and I've lots of that. But all these, the folk and the stories became part of it. And it's just such a strong thing. The Victor Jaras and the Violeta Parras and so on and so forth, and the Mercedes Sosas. It's just such a rich variety of music. The second strand to your answer is, back home is where you go to get respite and recover from these tremendous, overwhelming stories. And so I return to the punk. The punk successfully handles the anger. You know, if indignation isn't happening in anger, you're obviously not paying attention. So there's the kind of the return to which is by now the familiar. My traditional music, my Irish traditional music, is the Dead Kennedys and DOA and the Clash. That's what brings me back to a place of comfort, in a sense, and
Harmony.
Yeah. And then the third aspect of that is, yes, when you're walking down the street, it's very funny in Managua. You're on a bus, you're walking down the street, or you're on a bus, and suddenly Madonna comes on, or Bruce Springsteen. And Bruce Springsteen is singing Born in the USA in the middle of the Nicaraguan Revolution, and the locals they like it. They're not sort of up in arms saying, why are you playing this Born in the USA? Probably because they've got, you know, the political literacy has risen, and they understand that Bruce Springsteen is singing about another USA anyway. But that exists. That's like the superficial. So the pop songs on the radio, which to some extent mirror my experience, like there's some pop songs I really like those I can't think of her name right now, but you will probably. But that song that was like 10 weeks at #1, Havana, and the other one, Senorita. I love those songs. When they come on the radio, I want to dance and listen. Is it Olivia Rodrigo, or that it's somebody else? Maybe. Anyway,
maybe you could include them on your playlist.
Yeah, I mean definitely that song. Yeah, very much so. Those two songs I mentioned, which I've now forgotten the title this second, because they're just pop songs. They're chewing gum.
Yes.
They're gone. I've just lost it at what it was.
Yeah.
But they all form a part. But underneath is this, I did not meet many people going home to put on a Bruce Springsteen album
Yeah.
because, firstly, the lyrics are in English. Nobody speaks English. And they're listening to they have their own thing going on, which they grew up with, and which is because they still have a strong sense of community, it's all very rooted. And it's interesting that music has shifted very much in Latin America to hip hop and rap because there's now those roots have been broken. And the whole rise of cartels and the fragmentation and the constant migration, whereby if you're in Mexico, you move up and back to work, you leave your community, and the exposure to new ideas and new music means that that music now has become traditional to an older generation, but there's respect for it among younger people. But the music that speaks to them is some sort of rap music, which varies as much as the rap music we hear here. It's the good, the bad, and the absolutely awful.
Yeah. The reason why I quoted the Buena Vista Social Club earlier on is that because it's Ry Cooder's version of what he heard in Latin America. Do you think that is faithful to what you heard there?
I think that Ry Cooder is an individual, is an extraordinary individual. It's not anybody. It's not sort of like, it's not, let me think, if Justin Bieber decided he wanted to incorporate the sound of Colombia, I don't think he'd find the Buena Vista Social Club members. Ry Cooder has this very strong connection to the border, Latin American music, Flaco Jimenez, people who've played in his band who are rooted in that tradition. So he goes to Cuba and he meets the musicians behind the musicians. And it's very interesting that the Buena Vista Social Club, I mean, were any of them under 80 when he quote unquote discovered them? They were musicians who had big careers 50 years ago. And then they just became invisible. They just became local musicians again when Cuba was shut off from the rest of the world. So it's very particular. Ry Cooder and the Buena Vista Social Club belongs to a particular Cuban reality.
Yeah.
And but it exemplifies the fact that you have this incredibly high quality local music that when it's given a platform and a respect, takes over the world. It's got no problem competing with Madonna and anything else.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to the third period of your life now, which is back home, coming home, and you wrote a book about it. And one way I'd like for you to go into it is, do you think your experience of political life in Latin America changed your view of how things happened between Ireland and Britain? Or, how, the recent Irish history, the last 25 years or so?
Okay, you're gonna have to ask that question again.
Just has it changed, having lived in South America, has it changed for you the way you were perceiving Irish politics when you were younger?
I don't think it's changed the way I perceived politics when I was younger. I think it might change the way I perceive politics now. And I say that because
yes, I asked the question. That's exactly the question I wanted to ask. Sorry. It's the way I've asked it, it's the freshness there, but yeah, it's exactly it. Yes.
Yeah. So I guess back then I was, and again, we're back to the sense of age and wisdom, possibly. So as a teenager, I was rebelling against everything. My school, my family, the path that's set out for you when you live in Blackrock and you look into a future of university and a home and a job and a family and so on and so forth, and respect for institutions. That all sort of, you come to an age as a teenager when you actually have the confidence to say, I think this is bogus and I'm not signing up for this. You then go out into the world. And so in Latin America, I was fortunate to see the Sandinistas and then the Zapatistas and all the other incarnations of rebelliousness and change throughout Latin America. and in North America as well, because I would have made an awful lot of contacts in South America of people who were there because they'd fled North America for the same kind of reasons. Their country was intolerable. And then they go back and show me a different North America as well. There's lots of things happening in within that scale of things, the DIY scene, lots going on in terms of autonomy and possibility. But over the years, then there's something else happens then, whereby the measure you take of politics left and right and scenarios and situations shifts a bit. And so I find myself less, I object less to the Irish system than I did 40, 50 years ago. And I find more to like in it. And that probably helps having a small child as well. And conversely, then the Sandinista revolution, which, the public face was Daniel Ortega, you have a situation in which he has done an about face that is as radical as you can possibly get, whereby he has now sent out the police and the army to shoot people down the streets who are peacefully protesting. And he has turned white into black and black into white. He has, implemented the harshest anti-abortion regime because he needed the church as allies. He has implemented whatever he needs to stay in power. And so there's this realization over time that we must take an awful lot into account when we analyze the reality of life around us, situations around us. And while there is a absolute rottenness at the core of capitalism, which remains consistent from Ireland to England to France to South America, this strange thing called quality of life revolves a lot around your own stability and security. I see it for a 3-year-old, but I also see it for a 30-year-old or a 60-year-old. I see it for a woman in Mexico who wants to get home in the evening and has to implement an incredible series of precautions to get from A to B. I see it in the campesinos in Colombia, who now have a immensely innovative, different center-left former guerrilla in power, and they're still being killed off because there's a system there. It's systemic. There's so much that's systemic. And I guess in Ireland, the one pillar of the 1970s has been largely destroyed. And in its place, you have a somewhat vibrant, diverse, tolerant situation. It varies from town to village to family, but I do see a side of Ireland that I would have been slow. Well, I wouldn't have been slow to recognize. It wasn't there in the 70s, and it's there now.
And also you did something which is quite revolutionary in itself, is that you picked up on the Irish language again, which is something which, I think if you ask anybody who's gone to primary school and secondary school in Ireland, where the Irish language is compulsory, I think there's still a fierce, I would say, dislike is a kind of a soft word for the Irish language. And yet you came home and you picked up on something which is really considered quite a conservative, there's, for the listeners who don't know what we're talking about, the Irish language is compulsory in school, and yet it is really seen as something which is compulsory, therefore disliked. And yet you decided to come back to Ireland, settle in the Burren, which is this kind of lunar, really very specific, very weird lunar kind of landscape in Ireland, and learn the Irish language again. Maybe you'd like to talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, surprisingly, I think you have to go back. There's a certain punk rock prism through which this occurs. The Irish language is almost under the radar in this country. And all the interesting things happening in the Irish language are completely invisible to the other mortals walking around the same villages, towns, and cities. It's extraordinary, Danielle.
It's
and
magical.
This world, what's that?
It's magical.
It's quite magical. So yes, I was fortunate that I had some sort of capacity for languages, which meant that I didn't suffer Irish in school. I quite enjoyed it, but I did not connect it to a living language. I did not connect it to any sense of where I was going in life. It was Spanish, 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 and French to a lesser extent. So I tossed the Irish as soon as I finished the Leaving Cert and didn't think too much more about it. It's there because it's there. It's an official language, so
Yes.
it is to be heard and seen on occasion, but very peripheral. But the experience of going to all these Latin American communities, lots of them indigenous with their own language, and people fighting for land, language, all wrapped up in this idea of autonomy, which is quite a punk rock thing.
Mm.
That kind of, and the questions, what language do you speak? English. But you're Irish. Yeah. Like, what happened? What's with Irish? And I said, oh, well, yeah, there's Irish. And it's almost like, so there is Irish. Yeah. But you don't speak it now. But you learned it. Yeah. 14 years. Oh, so right from as a kid, but you don't speak it. No. Does
Oh,
anybody?
yeah.
No, not really. Nobody speaks it. So that all starts to ferment. And as a kind of, I think it's also, there's a bit of the Taurian in this, in that I can be quite stubborn. And so I was thinking to myself, well, here I am with my Spanish and my French. Surely I could maybe take a crack at the Irish and see what happens. And returning as an adult is such a radically different experience from learning as a kid in a school situation. There's almost a case for saying take Irish out of schools if there was a means to expose people to an immersive Irish experience instead. Because if the first time you have a conversation in Irish, which is not about, on my summer holidays last year, I went to the West Island and the people were lovely and it rained every day. When you take that into a situation of, say, there's this thing called the Gael Gordach, which is a comedy night in the Irish language, and you suddenly you're looking up at people who are every inch the diverse range as your own network, and they're funny, and suddenly the language becomes less significant in the sense that you're just enjoying an experience and the Irish language happens to be there. And yet there's a deep rooted sense that Irish takes us somewhere. It takes us into the landscape. And the problem is you start to get into this mystical language that sounds terribly, terribly ethereal to people, and they can't ground it, and they say, but what's the point? Well, there is no point, and that's excellent. Doing an activity that has no purpose
Free.
other than, whatever it might be. The Irish language experience very playful. I find it very amusing. I meet people. I've become a kind of a living embodiment of the Irish language, because with a 4-year-old, you speak a lot in playgrounds and you speak a lot in public so that people hear you. When they hear Irish, every Irish person has a reaction. It's usually along the lines of, oh, isn't that gorgeous? I wish I could do that. Or else it's, oh, I was beaten to death. And that's, I wish I had some Irish, but I was beaten half to death. Or else it's like, but isn't that language, God, you speak Irish? Are you from the Gaeltacht? No. So why? Why are you? And then, are you at a Gael school? No, he's not at a Gael school, actually. He just speaks it with me. I am his Irish language connection, pretty much, beginning, middle, and end. And so it's just become a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And it's opened a portal into this world of music, conversation, largely through the Irish language radio station, which again, it has no commercial purpose whatsoever, no ads.
Just like this radio station.
It's like your radio station,
Yeah,
Danièle.
that's right.
It's rock and roll, and it's punk rock, and it's
just like Shay's Radio Network.
Exactly. And so what you have is, you've got, like, on an afternoon show, they will interview a 13-year-old tennis player from the Connacht, or a 90-year-old priest who's retiring from Clifton. They will interview anyone they can find who's doing anything. And so it's actually a lot more open. And the one place I really saw that was during the Corrib Gas campaign. So you had the Shell to Sea campaign. You had the Shell, just for people who may not be familiar with it, you had this corporate attempt to move farmers off their land, take their land, install a large untested refinery and pipeline with all the risks attached, when it could have been done at sea, or it could have been rethought perhaps in a safer way. And it happened to land in this area that included part of the Gaeltacht and had a lot of Irish speakers. And of the 5 men who ended up in jail because they refused to give up their land to Shell, 2 of them were fluent Irish speakers and musicians. So suddenly, Orla G, you've got people speaking for an hour about this, whereas in the RTE and other networks, it was absolutely, the coverage was hostile, very hostile to the idea of people campaigning against a pipeline that's bringing gas around the country. And isn't that what progress is, you know?
Yeah. I mean, do you know the band Bog Bodies?
I've
They
heard the
have,
thing.
yeah, well, they have, I was just watching a video of theirs.
Bog bodies,
They
yeah.
have, yeah, they have a song about the Shell, that you should seek them out because they're like psychedelic and trad. You know, as much as the Tower, like the Rolling Stones and trad, these ones are psychedelic. It's like a real psychedelic band. But anyway, I wanted to talk to you for you. I mean, I just want to say another thing which was quite magical. Last year when we came to visit you, you brought us to see a concert on the rock, in the burn, on the rock. 2 people playing music with maybe what, 20 people watching them.
Mm.
And we had to walk a little, yeah, not that long, but I mean, you know, it wasn't playing on a stage or anything. It was a walk to the band in the middle of the rocks in the burn, which was quite extraordinary. I really thank you for that. That was a, I mean, I keep on remembering this with, you know, it's quite an extraordinary moment for me. So, you know, you don't need electrical equipment to be kind of, you know, it's this gesture of sharing music. Doesn't matter if there's one person or 600,000, you know, 600,000, a little bit more, or 80,000 actually, but it was a very good moment. And I think you probably have, you know, these experiences quite often, which people in the towns can't have anymore. And to go back and to maybe conclude, I'd like you to speak about your son, Fela, who is 4 or 5 now.
He's going to be 5 on the 16th of August.
Yes, and what's his, I saw a picture of him recently and he was dancing to the record player. So I would love to know what he's listening to and
Okay.
what you're making him listen to.
No, I'm not. Firstly, the notion that I could make him listen to anything is absolutely false. From an early age, I mean, the great thing about children, I think all children, is that they are there soaking up their surroundings in a very intense way, and they, you know, the greatest predictor of a child's taste in the early years are what the parents are doing. So that I'm playing records and I'm listening to music, and at some point, Fela really likes to know the mechanics of things, so he figured out the record player. And as soon as he figured out, well, he started with the CD player, because at a certain age, putting records on when he's 2 is a really bad idea because, you know, the little fingers, you can't actually handle something fine at that age. The fingers haven't got the suppleness.
Dexterity, yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, I would put various CDs on to see the reaction, and sorry, just actually, I should preface this by saying we move between Galway and the Burren. So his mum lives in the Galway, I'm in the Burren. So there are car journeys when he's coming to me, and in the car I had a range of CDs to make the journey easier, and they're these wonderful Irish language CDs, Googly Gug, and Scaling Baleen, a whole series of Irish CDs made for kids, but they are produced to the same quality as a gloaming CD. They're absolutely excellent. The musicianship that comes with them is excellent. And there's everything from tongue twisters to sort of percussion games that kids would do, banging a stick at school, to, you know, roguery, general roguery in these CDs. And Freda really likes them. So we come back into the house and I don't bring them in because they would probably be on forever. So they live in the car. So in the house, I'm playing other things, and he's got no patience. You know, I think there's a thing for children at that age that their ears can only take so much. And so music wouldn't be on that much. But he became very attached, rigorously attached, and you really should play this song if you can. I'll find it for you. There is a musician in Karna called Marcus Hernan, and part of I shouldn't really call them a dynasty, let's just call them a family, an extended family of amazing musicians. And he has an album called Quigalantina, which means sort of stoke the fire. And I think of it as, I mean, he is an absolute Irish traditional musician. But when I listen to it, I hear like a kind of an Irish techno, a crazy Irish techno theme that he is unaware of, but which just comes through because he's playing at a furious pace. Fela, when it comes to bath time, decided every night this was going on at top volume. It can't go on at a medium volume. It goes to the point where the speakers are going to burst.
Oh.
And so there's a big joke where there's two CDs sitting there. He knows how to put them on. And I say, look, there's a Manu Chao. I'd love to hear Manu Chao right now. Or you know what I'd love to hear? I'd love to hear Eddie Vedder, you know. And he says, I'll do that for you, Daddy. You just go away and I'll put it on. He secretly puts on Quigalantina, turns up the volume, and then looks at me. And then we begin what could only be described as a punk rock dance, where he's up and down the furniture. He's jumping on me. The same things I was doing at those specials gigs, you know?
Yes.
Then fast forward to the current thing where I want to do this vinyl experience live, and I need a different type of record player, a Bluetooth one. And the one I got happens to be extraordinarily simple. You press a button and the record goes on. You press a button and it comes off. Fela figured this out very quickly. And he had one album, Thomas the Tank Engine Stories. So morning, noon, and night, he's over at the record player putting this on. He now knows how to lift it and move it on to the second track if he doesn't want to hear it again. Then, unfortunately, I sent away for two more. And you're talking about albums from 1962, 1965, and 1972. 3 volumes of Thomas the Tank Stories. The person narrating them clearly is influenced by the psychedelics of the 1960s, because the sounds being made for the trains, the characters are really funny. They're incredibly funny. And then he's listening to that every day. He's at the record player. And I just love the idea that he's getting this, that the record player becomes a very routine. It's more routine than the toaster. It's as routine as the trampoline. It's just there, and he can handle it as if he was a mechanic of the record player. However, I carefully avoided discussing the issue of speed and the record player, because obviously we have 45 and 33. And it's bad enough listening to this album at 33, but fatefully 3 days ago, this is like a year after the record player began, he says to me, Daddy, what does that button do? And of course it was the speed. And Daddy has a policy of telling Fela as much as he can so that he has a full understanding. So I said, if I gave him a 7-inch single, and I said, this is how you play a 7-inch single. He tossed the 7-inch single very quickly and said, oh no, put back on Thomas, and played it at 45. Thomas is now being played at 45.
Oh, wow.
Always.
Yes. That's
so it's weird.
Yeah. Yes. I think we've probably reached the end of our time here on this interview anyway. Maybe we'll hear a little bit of Thomas on your playlist as well. Maybe that would be a nice way of concluding your playlist. Anyway, thank you very much, Michael, and I hope to see you in person very soon. And thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us, for our listeners on Blitzkrieg Pop, edition 35.
Sorry. I was just going to say thanks for pursuing it, because, you know, the way things go in life, you really have to tie these things down, and you did that very successfully. And yeah, thanks to anyone who's takes the time to listen, you know. Hope there's something of interest there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael.
Okay.